everyone. As you can see, I'm all dressed up for Halloween. I got a few private messages about those short stories I posted as videos the past 2 weeks. My friends said they weren't horror stories because they weren't scary. I wholeheartedly disagree. Those are the types of things that I find so frightening that I shit myself. But what is horror? Is it just a genre that allows us to confront our fears in a safe way? Or is there something more than that? And do any two people have the same idea of what frightening is? I remember when I was 3 years old. I had a friend whose favorite movie was Dumbo. I liked that movie, but every time it got to Pink Elephants on Parade, I had to crawl back up on the couch and cuddle up next to my mom. But in my defense, this the last time a piece of fiction really truly frightened me. Maybe it's because I'm an atheist, but I've never really been frightened by supernatural horror. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate movies like Todd Browning's Dracula, Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 1 and 2, and I really enjoy some lesser-known films like Peter Jackson's The Frighteners. If you haven't seen that, do yourself a favor. When this movie's over, go check it out. It's well worth it. It took me a long time to realize why movies that my friends loved, like Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Hellraiser, and Child's Play didn't bother me. In fact, watching them left me rather bored. It comes down to something said by the director John Landis. People kept asking him the best way to beat Dracula, and his response was always the same. You can beat a vampire any fucking way you want because vampires don't fucking exist. And I think that's it. Why bother being afraid of something you know doesn't exist? It sounds like an incredibly stupid thing done by incredibly stupid people. It's why children are the only ones who look under their bed for monsters. Monsters exist, by the way. They do. They're real. But you're not going to find them under your bed. Let's look at the great horror tropes, shall we? The ones so ingrained in our consciousness that we put them in kids' cartoons and on cereal boxes. The ghost, the werewolf, the golem, the vampire. The ghost is usually portrayed as the soul of someone who's passed on, but is tied to our world by unfinished business. Some are harmless. Others seek revenge. In either case, there's an easy way to deal with your ghost problem. The first being is to help them accomplish whatever their task is. The other way is to, not piss people off when they're alive so they haunt you when they're dead. And that should be simple enough. Not all ghosts are harmful. According to Russian legend, there are beings called domovoi, or household spirits. They're usually your distant ancestors. They protect your house when you're not around. Or they'll do small household chores. All you have to do is leave out a little crumb of food or maybe a small coin. Do you know what's scarier than a ghost? Your own mortality. Not that there's anything you can do about it. And it's really not all that scary. All you have to do is acknowledge that anything that lives has to die. And it's that impermanence that gives it value. An eternal life, whether it be in some torturous hell or some joyous paradise, either way, it's inherently pointless. I guess what I'm saying is, if something is important to you, you do it. You do it now. And if you love someone, tell them. Or you'll regret it. Unless you're like me, in which case they'll regret it if you do tell them. But we'll save that rant till Valentine's Day. If you hold on to that regret, you'll find yourself filled with remorse, alright. And you'll be stuck in a world where you don't belong. It'll be this one, while you're still alive. And the person you'll be haunting till the end of your days is you. This life is the only one we're sure exists, so don't waste it. Don't be afraid of ghosts. Be afraid of becoming a ghost inside a shell of flesh instead of ectoplasm. A soulless husk masquerading as a human being. Besides, you don't need to do that. I'm out there doing it for you, so you don't gotta. Next up is the werewolf. These are usually young men who turn into wolf creatures into the full moon, howling, snarling beasts that attack women in the dead of night. But hey, if they have a law degree, these days that makes them a shoo-in for the Supreme Court. Do you know what's scarier than a werewolf? Teenage boys. All those symptoms of lycanthropy I mentioned, they sound a lot like puberty. All those hormones flying around, all that hair growing. Yeah, it's easy to see where this myth came from, especially considering that it originated in Germanic and Mediterranean cultures, where people tend to be a little bit hairier anyway. Okay, so imagine you're a teenage boy with all these hormones flying around, and you live in a society where for centuries, women have allowed all sorts of indignities against their will. Now imagine that society has reached a point where some of them are saying, I'm not putting up with this shit anymore. Further, imagine that women actually enjoy sex and engage in it with people they actually give a damn about. And imagine some of these teenage boys still think they're owed. Now imagine you give that same kid who's angry that he can't get his end wet a gun. Oh wait, you have no need to imagine it. Just go turn on CNN. Chances are you'll find angry Santa Claus impersonator Wolf Blitzer reporting on it. It's what we should be afraid of, but we aren't. It's normal. It's an everyday occurrence. The fact that it is a normal everyday occurrence should scare you. The fact that this country has nothing to offer but half-assed thoughts and prayers and no will to do anything about it should scare the shit out of you. The fact that this country allows a lobbying group to not only foster this mentality, but profit from it should make you want to vomit through your humanity's forsaken nostril. The next up is the Golem. This originated as an old Yiddish folk story outside of Prague. It's about a rabbi who brings a sculpture to life. He orders it to defend the Jews of the village. Over time, he gives it other small tasks to do. Now from here there are two different versions of the story. Some say the Golem was super strong and simple-minded. He took things so literally that he just accidentally kills the rabbi and hurts people. But the more common version has the rabbi losing control of the Golem and having it run amok. I mentioned this as a horror story because Mary Shelley took this and turned it into her novel, Frankenstein, A Modern Prometheus. Only her version was a little bit more anti-science. I'm actually a firm believer in science. I think it can help us accomplish many great things. But it is a tool. And like any tool, it depends on whose hands you put it in. And any tool can be used for good or ill. When people think radioactivity, they think bombs. And not just any bombs, some of the most destructive weapons human beings have used on each other in wartime. What the United States did to the Japanese at Hiroshima and Nagasaki is unconscionable. They took out military and civilian targets in an indiscriminate fashion. It left between 129,000 and 226,000 people dead. But at the same time, when properly maintained and upgraded, nuclear power plants provide cheap electricity that makes much of our daily life possible. On the surface, they seem better than coal power plants. On the other hand, when they aren't properly maintained, well, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, those are messes that won't go away for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. So maybe they're not that much better. And I've talked to people at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission who say they can't watch The Simpsons anymore because its portrayal of the C. Montgomery Burns energy conglomerate is a little too accurate. That should frighten you. But radiation has other uses. It's used in MRIs. You find broken bones with X-rays. Radiation is often used to treat cancer patients. And don't forget the sun. It's a nuclear fusion reactor. It just happens to be 93 million miles away from us. And yet, it supplies the light required for almost every form of life on Earth. So, what should we be afraid of if not Golem, Frankenstein or science? How about blind ignorance of science? There are people out there who don't want to eat any genetically modified food simply because Monsanto made a type of crop that's immune to weed killers. Eating crops that have been soaking in weed killer that are known carcinogens probably isn't a good idea. But none of those crops have ever made it to the consumer market. Most people forget or perhaps don't even know about all the accomplishments of genetic engineering. I was skeptical about this next example myself, but did you know using a combination of genetic engineering and selective breeding, you can create a corn that pops easier? I didn't see the benefit either. Not until I found out that the United States uses 17 million quarts of popcorn every year. That's about 18 Empire State Buildings. And about a third of that doesn't even pop. If more companies switched to using this breed, they could cut that down to 1/6, which would mean about 3 Empire State Buildings full of corn that could be used to feed the homeless. Then there are people who are afraid of getting vaccines. Not getting vaccinated because you have a legitimate health problem like an autoimmune disorder is one thing. Doing so because you're afraid of autism, that threat is non-existent. It was written by a guy who had a patent on an alternative and less effective form of vaccine. He had a vested interest in defaming his competition. Not only that, none of his research has ever been able to be duplicated in a laboratory. Your risk of getting autism from a vaccine is about the same as getting struck by lightning while falling off a ladder inside your house and getting a black eye and then being crushed by a stampede of wild elephants and a baby zebra between the hours of 3:55 and 4 p.m. on the 4th of July during a hailstorm. It's not happening. But people believe it, and this leads them and their children to not get vaccinated. The last 10 years have seen a rise in whooping cough, typhus, and measles, mostly in children and infants. People who rely on the protective bubble of immunity of their parents, loved ones, and caregivers to protect them. I know the names of these illnesses might sound silly, but they can be fatal. The last monster I want to talk about is the vampire. Vampires change from story to story. Sometimes they're sparsely brooding guys who aren't really scary at all. Other times they're purple guys obsessed with teaching you to count. And then there's this guy. No, not him. Him! Hey, no, not him. Well, if he played a vampire, I'd believe it. He's a national treasure. No, I meant this guy. In most legends, vampires are blood-sucking monsters that hypnotize women. Or turn into a bat, or mist. Sometimes they look like normal people. Sometimes they resemble a bloated, decayed corpse, like Count Orlok in the movie Nosferatu. In any case, they're always kind of rapey. Do you know what's scarier than a vampire? It's the way the romantic lead, or sometimes the priest in these movies, will react to seeing the lovely lady turned into one of the undead. Like that's what she wanted or something. I know there are good priests, pastors, rabbis, imams, and other clergymen out there. I thought this script was going a little harsher on religious folks than I was really comfortable with, so I consulted with one of them. And there are some out there who really want to bring something positive into the world. But those aren't the men of the cloth you see in vampire movies. What makes the clergymen you see in vampire movies so disturbing is that is exactly the same argument you see used by clergymen, televangelists, and politicians when discussing actual rape victims. That was their fault. Maybe they shouldn't have worn that skirt that night, or maybe they shouldn't have had a beer. Instead of, blaming the rapist. Remember when I said monsters existed? Well, they do. They're just not supernatural beings made of pure terror. No, don't be silly. But they are horrible creatures. They belong to the genus Homo and the species Homo sapien. That's right, I'm talking about human beings. The most terrifying thing in the world are those tiny little offenses each and every one of us commit every day without even realizing it. Or the everyday evils we turn a blind eye to and say, that's not my problem. Or the things that we do to our friends and loved ones in anger. Or worse, the things we do because we're trying to help. And those are the types of evils I wrote those stories to address. The way I see it, ghosts, vampires, golems, werewolves, and demons aren't costumes we wear on Halloween. They are masks we put on our fears the rest of the year. We try to disguise our personal bête noirs, so we don't have to acknowledge what they really are. They don't exist as something independent of us. They exist as something within us. Or sometimes as us. On Halloween, you don't become something else for a day. You become what you already are. And that's the scary thing. Because everyone knows they're a monster, or at least the potential for it is there. So we try to restrain it in ritual. Different cultures do it in different ways at different times. In the US and Canada, we have Halloween. The British have Guy Fawkes Day. Hispanic culture has the Day of the Dead. While not in the months of October or November, the French have Mardi Gras. The somewhat different tradition of wearing masks, exchanging small gifts or food exists in the Jewish tradition of Purim, though it's my understanding, which I admit comes only from having dated a few agnostic Jewish women over the years, is that it isn't observed quite as much in the United States as some Jewish holidays. Not because it's taboo or anything, but because Halloween sort of took its place as more conservative and reformed Jews assimilated. No matter what you celebrate or what day, the idea is still the same. Contain the beast to one night and that's it. If we were ourselves all the time, that wouldn't be pretty. And what does my Raphael costume say about me? Well, I love pizza. I want to be the hero. At the same time, part of me thinks humanity might not be worth saving. Or that they'll resent me for trying. And that pisses me off to no end. But I keep trying anyway. Because that's just who I am. Well, that's it for this week. If you like this video, hit the button. Or just subscribe. Wait, I said I was going to talk about Stephen King. Right, I can make it quick since this ties into what I just said. Okay, I asked a lot of my friends what they thought King's scariest works were. Most of them said stuff like Salem's Lot, The Stand, It, and The Shining, which are all good books, but not what I would consider scary. Oh, and scratch The Shining off the list. Most of them meant Stanley Kubrick's take on The Shining. It's a very different animal. It's an amazing movie in terms of visuals, but the only thing scary about it is what Kubrick did to Shelley Duvall. The book The Shining even frightened King himself. It's one of the 2 books that got him to ease up on the cocaine. By King's account, The Shining is the only movie based on his work that he can't rewatch. And yes, that includes Maximum Overdrive, which you know, is just pristine with trucks. For me, the scary King stories are stuff like Dolores Claiborne, Gerald's Game, The Body, and in today's political climate, Apt Pupil. But, again, not the movie. The scariest thing about that is Bryan Singer. Sorry, that joke is in really bad taste, I know. Oh, but I can't leave off the first King I ever read, Misery. These stories are fiction, and at times can get far-fetched, but the evils they represent are all too real. With a little less sensationalistic exaggeration, they could happen. Hell, they probably do happen. But they aren't considered sexy enough to make the newscast, so we never hear about it. Now, The Body is a strange one to put on King's scariest list. Apart from maybe The Regulators, it is the closest thing King has ever done to a comedy. At least so much as the Gordon LeChance stories within the story read as almost a parody of Stephen King. But what The Body says about people, about growing up, about trying to hold on to the way things are, about the end result of helping people, and how it might not be worth it, that is terrifying.